Hello, Child Nexus community. Thanks so much for joining me here today. Today, we are talking about two subjects that overlap: auditory processing and language processing, how they're related and how they impact kids who struggle with both. My guest today is Lois Kam Heymann. She is a speech and language pathologist with over 40 years experience working with children with listening, hearing, and learning challenges. She is the leading authority of auditory processing disorder and auditory language processing challenges. And she's here today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Lois. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today.
I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad to have you as a member of the Child Nexus community. You know, we're interdisciplinary. We have a number of professionals from different backgrounds who all work with kids who think and learn differently. You are a speech language pathologist, and I actually became aware of your work when we spoke at the Diverse Minds, Bright Futures Expo. I think I walked by your room and peeked in for a moment. You, Sally Shaywitz, Matthew Hayutin, who is also a Child Nexus member, were presenters. And I was really intrigued by your focus on listening skills and the link between auditory processing and language. And I was intrigued because so many parents say, he doesn't listen. She doesn't listen. They don't listen. And I know that you answer that question for parents all the time. Lois, why are children not listening?
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
So I'd love to kind of talk about, when parents come to you and they say, my child is not listening, what are some questions that you have that help you figure out where the issue is with listening? Because it's usually not just an auditory problem.
Right. So I think it's really interesting to think of auditory skills and auditory skills that start not in the ear, because if the child has passed their universal hearing screening, they hear. But listening are really pathways that go from the ear to the brain. And if a child is having difficulty in those pathways, then the sound that reaches the child's brain that understands perfectly may be distorted or delayed. And so if that's true, that may be an auditory processing disorder. But we also have kids that have difficulty listening, which shows up in a couple of ways that parents come to me. They might say that when the child's in quiet, they have no problem at all understanding. But if it's a noisy environment, they're not able to respond appropriately or know what was said. They might say, my child can't follow step directions. And we think of that very often as a language problem, but not that it really starts in the listening and being able to hold on to information over time and then execute. They may say that my child has less vocabulary, or they might say that the way that they pronounce words, not just an articulation disorder, but the way that they scramble sounds in words, or they say a word that sounds like the word they want to say, that may be another sign that there's something that there's a problem or a delay or a distortion in the listening that goes to language. And so that connection is really important to think about.
And that's really important because some of the things that you're saying about, what parents might see, my child, again, having trouble listening, especially in noisy environments, not following instructions well. I often hear from parents that I always have to clarify, or my child is asking me to repeat things that I've just said to them. And way back in episode 49, we talked to B. Braun about auditory processing disorder. And we said that based on what you're describing and what I've seen and what she has seen, some kids who have this language difficulty or auditory processing difficulty are often misdiagnosed as having another disorder like ADHD. Do you see that?
Well, absolutely. So the way that I look at auditory language connection, which when I'm doing an evaluation or I'm speaking about this topic, I always talk about not auditory processing and not language processing, but the connection between going from auditory processing of information into the processing of language. And then language can be either receptive and or expressive language. And that for me, that there's a thread that goes from where the breakdown is in the auditory system that may show up in the language system, whether it's phonological and into reading, because you mishear the P for the B, or, and so that changes everything, or it may be into the language and holding on to information through auditory memory. So if we stop just at the auditory breakdown, right, then we don't follow that path. But back to your question about the difference between auditory processing and ADHD, right, or what we used to call ADD, is that one is an attentional disorder, right? That's ADHD. And one is when it's just through listening. So the child who has an auditory processing difficulty may look out the window and not be attentive because what they're hearing isn't making sense to them in language. I can give you an example if you'd like.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so let's say it's a third grader, and the child's listening, and the teacher said, and then the girl went to bed. And our kid thinks that the teacher said, and then the girl went to dead. A D for a B, right? Acoustically, D and B, not just reversals of letters when they write, but D for B share the same acoustic environment. So it's a very common problem. So the child in the moment has to be able to say, oh, that doesn't make sense. The teacher is talking about pajamas and nighttime. It must be bed. And if they have to, and then, of course, that's taken 3 to 4 seconds. And so then what's happened in those 3 to 4 seconds, the teacher continues to talk. And now our child has missed that. And they might not be able to catch up. So what do when we don't understand? We know we hear it, but we don't understand? We look out the window, we fidget with something, we start writing notes. As adults, what do? If I was speaking to you like I am right now, every third word I said was in Japanese. How long would it take you not to listen to me?
Right.
So very often these kids are diagnosed with attentional disorder, where it may be either a standalone auditory processing disorder or a combination of the two.
Right. And that's why, I always advocate for doing a more comprehensive evaluation when you don't know, because you really want to be able to distinguish between some of the things that you've talked about, the inattention versus an auditory processing issue. And one of the issues I'm seeing is that the impact downstream when someone is saying hearing dead when it's really bed, that has the potential to impact listening comprehension as well, right?
Absolutely. So it's interesting where that thread goes, right? That's a discrimination disorder, right? So there's 6 or 7 parts of auditory processing. Can you hear the pitches that are different? So if you can't hear pitch difference, I can't hear, if you don't see my face, which your listeners don't, you can't hear the difference between nice sweater and nice sweater. Now think about that. The child who understands the word nice sweater, but doesn't hear the pitch differential, is not going to know that somebody's being sarcastic versus somebody being friendly and complimentary. That's one type of auditory processing. How does that affect social skills? Then you think about if the child's hearing dead for bed, then what are they storing as bed and all the things that go with bed in the auditory memory? So auditory difficulties in whatever area those are will affect auditory memory, step directions, holding on to information over time, possibly phonological skills, hearing the sound symbol to be able to blend and delete and do all of those phonological processes, and or language, how much vocabulary the child stores, how they can retrieve it, how they can use it. It actually is the lowest point of breakdown for many children. So if you end up working on the upper skills like listening comprehension, but the reason the child doesn't have good listening comprehension is because of this auditory breakdown, you're just spinning your wheels, right? Because you have to get down to where the breakdown is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the things I always say is that you have to understand why the child is struggling. Otherwise, you don't know where to intervene, and you're not intervening appropriately in most instances if you're just looking at the behavior or the outcome of the processing issue.
And that you bring up a really good point there. It's also when you say the word behavior, how many behaviors in the negative part of behavior, how many parts of behavior are because a child is frustrated and doesn't understand, and because this is a hidden disability, it's so frustrating to the child because they heard what they heard and they understood what they understood, but it might not be what was said.
Right.
And so you have to think of the frustration and what happens to self-esteem to children that are constantly wrong, even though nobody knows why.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that, we have a tendency to compartmentalize a lot of these issues, auditory processing, language processing. And what you're describing is just the connection between auditory processing and language processing and literacy and social functioning. I mean, they're all interconnected because we communicate with other people via language. And we understand information that is processed because we hear it first and then we have to process the language.
Exactly. So if you think about a baby, right? The baby is learning auditory skills from the moment they're born. Their hearing is turned on, but their pathways are not yet resilient and functioning. So the input, the auditory input for the baby is what starts building those listening skills, those pathways. And those pathways grow actively from birth until 15 years of age. So we have the opportunity to go in, no matter when we see the breakdown, we have the opportunity to go in through intervention and really strengthen, make those connections.
Absolutely. And that's such an important point. And I'm thinking right now, we're recording this over the summer. We're at a transition point where an academic year has ended. Many parents in the fall are getting ready to send their kids off to kindergarten. And I did an interview with Debbie Reber a while back on kindergarten readiness. And based on the conversation we're having right now, it is so clear to make sure that kids entering kinder have foundational listening and language skills, because we know those early skills predict reading skills, academic success, and also the ability to navigate socially. Are there things that parents can do to develop their children's listening skills for school and social success?
Well, absolutely. And I think that that's why we have to separate what we're talking about between auditory processing disorder, which cannot be diagnosed which is diagnosed originally by the audiologist, like B. Broughton, who you had on your out here in Los Angeles. But that can't be really diagnosed till age 7. But children are showing signs of listening difficulties, what I call listening challenges, because of auditory processing difficulties, or just because the way society is right now and children aren't learning the skills they need in order to listen actively and attentively, right? And that what that looks like at home is actually being in conversation with your child. And the conversation isn't question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, but rather, I wonder what would happen if, open-ended questions, or and talking about ourselves and opening it up to discussion with children, no matter what age they are. Reading to children, continuing to read to children, because language comes in through that auditory channel. Narrating for very young children during play, narrating what you're doing. Oh, I'm putting the blocks up, 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 and I've built a beautiful tower. Oh, look at you. You're also building a tower. And they say, oh, no, it's not a tower. And you say, oh, and then you start this conversation, right? Kids need auditory input. They need good, active nursery rhymes for rhythm and rhyme, singing and dancing. All of these build listening skills, right? Which are just everyday skills. But because of our busy culture, because of everybody having very little time to sit, we have to think about 15 minutes a day with a child actively engaged in listening and speaking is a huge change in their ability to go to school with more vocabulary and more active listening skills. It really is as simple as that, you know?
Absolutely. And I'd love for you to, and we spoke a little bit about this before we hit record, but changes that you've seen since COVID in terms of the listening area for kids, because that's really important in terms of parents taking the time to have those conversations, because it seems that we are so busy and we spend a lot of time on our devices, which is going to be a whole other podcast episode. But oftentimes we're not engaging enough. We're not spending enough time engaging in that back and forth, speaking, listening with our kids.
Exactly. And that's the only way to build the resiliency of the pathways is by the good auditory input. I call it the auditory diet, right? And so, is what you're feeding your kids healthy food. You're giving them time to play, but what auditory diet are you giving them? But back to your question. So about 10 years ago, we started seeing a very big change in the way children came to school in kindergarten, being able to attend to the teacher, listen, hold on to the information, and also have enough vocabulary to understand what the teacher was saying, right? And the reason, of course, goes back to screens. And I'm not saying that children shouldn't be on screens. It's part of life. But what we have to realize about screens is that it's a visual event. It's not an auditory event. So what they get auditorily from looking at screens is either disembodied voices, beep, beep, boop, boop, Dora the Explorer's disembodied voice, and there's no vocal listening interaction. So, but the more time children are on screens, it may be building amazing skills for them in other parts of their brain, but it's actually causing non-growth in their auditory system, which are your listening skills and your language skills, right? And so that's one thing. Then we got COVID, right? And COVID was isolating, and these babies coming out of COVID that are, they had preschool at home on screens or none at all. And so what they didn't do, they didn't lose their auditory skills. They just didn't build the ones that would happen at 2, at 3, at 4. Can we go back in and build that? Absolutely. But we have to recognize that that's what's happened. And what you hear from kindergarten teachers last year was disastrous because the kids had to learn how to socialize and how to learn how to sit and attend, all using their auditory skills that weren't there. And then teachers' job is not to teach auditory skills. That's not their job. That kids are supposed to come with those. So now, I run a program of professional development for teachers, how we build auditory skills in the classroom. Because if they're not coming with them, now it's up to the teachers to do that.
Right. And I'm sure that, this is your area of expertise and there are best practices for helping kids to develop those auditory skills, those listening skills. And I'm sure it also depends on whether you're talking about toddlers, preschoolers, and even early elementary school children.
And late elementary school children. And we have found that even though I said the pathways are building during those first 15 years, they're still resilient, and neurologically, we are constantly evolving. And I work with adults who are diagnosed late with auditory processing disorder, and we still can make changes in the way that once we know where the breakdowns are. So it's never too late to work on listening skills, and it's never too early to work on listening skills.
Absolutely. And are there any strategies? I know that, when parents work with you and they're going to get a lot out of the programs that you have because you have such rich information, you're pulling information from research. But if parents are saying, my kids aren't listening, is there anything that I can do over the summer months to help with auditory processing or listening before we can get them in for an evaluation to determine whether or not there's something really there that needs to be addressed?
Sure. Again, I think it's mostly through play, right? And it's through play by talking as you play and opening up that communication. So whether you paint with your child or you color with your child for 10 minutes, it's the talk that happens and the identification of what you're doing. Wow, that coloring is beautiful. I love the way you use red and green together. That looks beautiful. That is input, right? Singing a song or making up a song about something the child's resistant to do, like a transition. So with very young children singing, oh, we're going to wash our hands, and putting a rhythm and a tune to it activates the listening system. Giving children 3-step simple directions. I'm talking about young children now. 3-step simple directions. Oh, we're going to go to the beach. Let's see, a towel. You need your pail, and don't forget your flip-flops. Oh, what are we going to get? And they say towel. You say, uh-huh. And then I think you're going to dig. Oh, pail. You need something on your feet. Flip-flops. Okay, let's go get towel, right? And so what you're training them to do is hear it, hopefully visualize it, store it, retrieve it. These are such simple activities. And actually, I do have a book called The Sound of Hope. And the second half of that book is all strategies for parents of children under 8 for activities, how to read to a child, rhythm and rhyme, and the things that we can do at home that we may not be doing, but don't take a lot of time and aren't like, I need an hour or I need to, but can be done while you're cooking, right? If the child's there while you're cooking, talking about the steps of cooking are listening activities. I know it sounds so simple, but in simplicity, it's very profound.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much language that we as adults internalize. And what I'm hearing you say is that when we have children around us who may be struggling with listening, with auditory processing, with language, we really have to externalize that internal dialogue so that they hear our processes. And that helps build their language skills. I can see when they're repeating instructions in their head, when you talked about the pail, the towel, the flip-flops, that's activating their working memory systems. And you're also helping them to develop executive functioning skills when you're describing the process of how you prepare a meal.
Exactly. And I think that built into listening skills, how we build listening skills does lead. So for me, it's hearing, processing, auditory processing, turning it into language, storage, retrieval, short-term, long-term, and then working memory. That we have to complete that chain, right? To get the child to go and be able to carry out the direction. which is beautiful, right? We're laying out the system for them, and we're modeling it, which is the only way parents really can teach, is by modeling the behavior, modeling the language, modeling, rather than this, again, question answer or demand of the right answer.
Yes. And you're doing such important work, and making those connections is so important because, again, I think a lot of people haven't made the connection between all of those things, which impact the way we interact, the way we take in information, process information, retrieve information. Can you tell our listeners about Listen, Love, Learn?
Sure. I'd love to. ListenLoveLearn is the name of my company and my website, www.listenlovelearn.com. And besides being an interventionist, which I have been for the last 48 years, and I build programs. And I build programs to train, because I feel that, coming to me as an individual practitioner is, how many kids are those? And when I wrote my book, the reason I wrote my book was to teach others about this. And that was with the help of Rosie O'Donnell, getting the word out there, because I was her son's therapist. But for Listen, Love, Learn, I have programs that either train the speech language pathologist or reading interventionist, which is my masterclass 1 in auditory processing disorder. And that teaches people how to do this intervention based on my system of bottom up, which are auditory skills, and top down, which is language, metacognitive, metalinguistic skills, and how they meet and how they affect each other, and how the child moves through that system to improve their skills. I also have a professional development for schools, for teachers, and that's called Listening Skills in Schools, and that's for teachers teaching any grade, where I come in and I teach about how to easily incorporate listening skills into your class day, and also how to sort of diagnose when a child may be having difficulty with listening rather than behavioral and then the third one is called Sounds Fun, and Sounds Fun is a pre-K and kindergarten completely written program on how, with lesson plans, pictures, the books, and it's looking at how to give listening, language, phonological skills to all children, no matter where they're coming into the program. And it's facilitated either by a speech language pathologist doing a push into a class, doing it individually in their therapy session, and or the teachers learning it, and then being able to incorporate it not as a separate mandated program, but adding it to what they're already doing to enrich what they're doing. I also do this Sounds Fun as a kindergarten enrichment, privately, separately, and offering that. And then it's the basis of the program that at Park Century School, they're starting a K1 next year, and I'm writing the program based on Sounds Fun and listening, language, and phonological awareness. So I'm doing a lot with it, trying to get to everybody. And then, of course, parents, which is why I have the book. So my mission is really to get people to understand these connections and help them gain the tools to help them with the child, their own child, or with the child in their class, or the child in their therapy room, and how to add it to people's toolbox. Not say this is it, but this is something that's different than what we usually do.
Lois, I love the work that you're doing. And I love that you are helping individuals who interact with kids at so many different levels, whether it's parents, teachers, or working with the children themselves. I appreciate you. I'm grateful for the work you're doing and for your time today. If listeners want to get in touch with you to sign up for your masterclass or join your Listening with Lois program, what is the best way for them to reach you?
So it's my website again is www.ListenLoveLearn.com. Lois at ListenLoveLearn.com is the way to reach me through the internet. And please, visit the programs. And if people have any questions, they just have to contact me. And then I set up a consultation. I do consultations, phone consultations, and explanations. And I do have a master class starting July 16th. And it's a 10-hour course with professional development hours attached to it. So for speech pathologists, learning specialists, that's who usually take the classes, sometimes OTs, sometimes audiologists, anybody that's working with kids that really wants to delve into the how-to of this. That's what that class is for.
Wonderful. And I will be sure to put a link to your website and to the book that you mentioned in the show notes. Thank you again so much for being here, Lois. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to be out here in LA and having made contact with you and Child Nexus. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for listening today. If you want more information about auditory and language processing challenges, be sure to check out our show notes. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.